by Harriet Lerner. Harriet, as many of you have heard me talk about, is one of my favorite thinkers in the self-help area. Her book, The Dance of Anger, I think is a masterful work and an insightful work on boundaries. It definitely impacted my own life personally when I read it several years ago, and it's something that I use and recommend to parents often. Gets us a shift in thinking, and I love when there's a thinker out there that says something that is not common sense, that goes a little bit deeper or has an angle. Her most recent book, Why Won't You Apologize? Tonight I'll be reviewing, and for the most part, I'm going to be talking about all the principles in the book. I would also encourage you to read it if you find this subject important, either whether you're on the side of the person doing the apologizing or if you're on the side of the one having been hurt, waiting, hoping, or struggling with somebody else's apology. So either side you're on, this book addresses both. And there's going to be a couple of points I'm going to throw in here. And every time that I put in an idea that wasn't necessarily covered or focused on in the book, I put a little asterisk by it. Everything else is directly out of the book, out of her book, and I'll expand on all of those. All right, let's get right into it. I love this quote. Sometimes the failure of the other person to apologize when they should hits us harder than the deed they should apologize for. I think so many people that I work with, when they find themselves in what seems like an impasse, unable to move on, it's often because somebody hasn't apologized. But in some ways, it's really just an extension of continuing to do the same kind of thing. It's hard to move through something when it is still happening to you. And I think we don't realize all the time that it's still happening to us. And so part of that can be, you can move past it with an apology, but also ideally you're doing it something different. Something different is happening in the relationship. So this is a big part of it. Harriet talks about the many faces of I'm sorry. Sometimes we apologize for an unintentional, not your fault kind of thing. I often do that as a therapist. I'm apologizing for something I wasn't involved in. And it's not saying I'm sorry I caused it. In fact, a lot of people will correct me when I apologize. I'm really saying I'm sorry you had to go through this. I'm sorry you had such a painful experience in whatever they're sharing with me. And sometimes if we're late and there's a traffic accident on the freeway and we didn't make it on time and somebody's upset with us, there's nothing in that is necessarily our fault, and we can still apologize. Interestingly, some people even struggle with this kind of apology. And Harriet talks about it. The phrase that she uses, that when you lose sense of your own self-worth, that it becomes difficult to apologize. My language I often use is when you don't know that you're okay, that you're an okay person, that you have good intentions, and then you take it upon yourself to try to prove that to the other person, to try to be good, quote unquote. That's when you have a difficult time apologizing or taking responsibility for something. When you're in a place, and that can be, for some of us, that can be something that's consistent. I think for most of us, it's something that we experience sometime during the day, but sometimes during the day or the week, we don't experience a sense of okayness. And so even in these small, so-called easier apologies, it can sometimes be difficult to say you're sorry. And then, the apologies can get harder. Something where you've really hurt somebody that you love, somebody where some situation where your shame gets piqued, triggered. Sometimes if you're being lambasted or attacked by the other person, those all tend to increase the difficulty of the apology. But again, we can have struggle in all of these areas. What happens after the apology is important also. Does the behavior change? Is there an intention to try to do it differently? And if there's not an intention to try to do it differently, that can be difficult. Does the person accept our apology? Having our apology not accepted can make it difficult. Not being able to, Harriet talks a lot about not being able to predict ahead of time how the person is going to respond to it. And that's where I talk about this idea that apologizing is a gift of love. And when we give a gift of love, we essentially give it not for the purpose of getting something back, forgiveness, for example, but we give it as a gift to the other person, as an expression of our love, our empathy, our care, our compassion for them, our recognition that we've done something harmful or hurtful in the process or in the relationship. So what happens after the apology can be a big piece that can prevent us, right? That can cause us to have the impulse to not do it, but also it can be something that if we prepare well for, then we know how to accept it. I talk about this too often. Sometimes people get more angry after we apologize. And if we're not willing to sit in that, to be curious and to listen and to ask to hear more, then we might not be ready to give an apology. And Harriet talks about don't give an insincere apology. Don't give it too quickly before you're ready to give it. Make sure it's grounded in this experience where you're going to provide some healing, some listening to the other person. Beyond the how-tos, there are a few lists that she gives us that I'm going to refer to this evening, but she asks us to go beyond the how-tos. And she says both personal integrity and success in relationships depend on our ability to take responsibility for our part and only our part, even when the other person is being a jerk. And by not taking responsibility for the other person's part, you're not taking responsibility for how they react, right? She gives an example in the book where a child, an adult child, is blaming her mother in the divorce for her father's then later on alcohol problems. And the mother is very clear to say, I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry that I wasn't there for you. I'm sorry that you were hurt in this process. I'm sorry that we couldn't make it work. All of those things. And she goes on at one point to say, and I'm not sorry for your father's alcoholism. That's not my responsibility in this. But I am sorry for how I've hurt you. I'm sorry for how I hurt the family. So making sure that we don't go beyond, because that can also ring of insincerity. And it also models for other people some inappropriateness in terms of our boundaries, our psychological boundaries. Why is it so difficult for humans to offer clear expressions of responsibility and remorse for our hurtful words and actions? And she talks about this idea of losing sense of your own worth in the process, or I talk about not having a sense of your own okayness. There's one small point in the book that I don't agree with Dr. Lerner on, and that is this idea about guilt and shame. She makes this point. In fact, I often cite her talking about guilt. That guilt is not necessarily an indication that we've done something wrong. We might feel that we've done something wrong, but it's not necessarily a reliable source of that we've done something wrong. Lots of people feel guilty for things in situations where they haven't done anything wrong. So she talks a little bit about that. I think guilt can be as preventative. It can prevent us from apologizing as much as shame can at times. Because if we're supposed to be the kind of person that doesn't hurt people, and we feel guilty for having hurt people, that can be a barrier. That could be something we want to protect ourselves from. We're going to steer away from the guilt, and so we're going to remain in denial about what we've done, or being able to come in this very generous, open way. So guilt and shame are barriers, not low self-esteem, low self-worth, not knowing that you're okay. The more work that I've done in my life, and it's taken a long time to get a sense of my okayness, the more I'm willing to show up in a relationship and admit to my idiocies, right? Admit to being imperfect. Apologize for how I've hurt somebody. And I'm getting better that I have less and less inclination to be right, or to the need to come off appearing good, because I have a sense now, more than I did when I was younger, that I already am good. I'm already good enough. I'm doing the best that I can. And that includes a lot of imperfections, of course. What drives the non-apologizer or the female over-apologizer? And she says these are often split into genders, but they don't necessarily have to stay there. And she talks about, I'll start off with the female over-apologizer. She had a friend that would apologize for everything. She even said to her, we were walking down the sidewalk and my elbow bumped up against her, and her friend apologized. And she said at one point, I can imagine that if I had shoved you off the sidewalk onto the grass, that while you were laying there on the ground, you would look at me and apologize for getting in the way of my elbow. And so when somebody feels the need, you've seen this kind of person, to apologize profusely all the time, then it loses its value, and it becomes this call for something else, for validation. The other person is oftentimes asking you to take care of them. It might even be a request to affirm them in the process. And of course, the non-apologizer, we've talked about what it can be like for them. Some people are never going to be open to it. Some people are constitutionally, if not incapable, but nearly incapable of apologizing because of the barriers that we've already discussed. Why are people that do the worst things the least able to own up? Most likely shame. Most likely low self-worth. It requires a vulnerability, and vulnerability comes from a place of strength, right? So if we have a weakness, a deficit, a sense that we're not okay, that we're having to prove ourselves, that we're going to have a difficult time opening up in that way. How do we sort out who is responsible for what? There's a lot in this book that makes that clear. It's very similar, and I'm going to refer to this earlier. It's very similar to when the parent that we work with takes the responsibility for what the child has done on them, instead of saying, no, I'm sorry for what I did to you. Not how you reacted to it. That then becomes your work. Excuse me. That then becomes your work. But my work is to be accountable, responsible for how I've treated you in this process and mistakes that I've made. I was talking to a parent recently who was planning a visit out to the field. And we were kind of rehearsing role playing ways in which she might be there for her child. And the last thing I said to her was, it's okay if you make a mistake, because then you can apologize, and that might even be more valuable. Then your child won't think or have the experience that she's the only one that's screwing up. It'll actually make her feel safe in some ways. How do we, the hurt party, unwittingly contribute to the other person's defensiveness and refusal to apologize? We can, of course, be overly critical. We can be intimidating in tone and language and accusation. Go on the attack. That can make it challenging. Can we even look at that? I'm going to talk a lot tonight about this idea that I have, that I've been sharing lately, sometimes on the webinars and sometimes with people that I work with. This idea that you can, finding something to apologize to your children about, your children that are in our program about, finding that place can be one of the best bridges, the most effective bridges to connect to them, to increase emotional safety. And so one of the things that I often think about is to say to others, what do I do that's unsafe? I must, and if I can even think of something that I do that makes me unsafe, then I'll offer that. I get very anxious. I get very worked up. I can see how you would have a hard time coming to me and being vulnerable because of the way that I have reacted or sometimes do react. How can we get past life-draining anger and bitterness when the wrongdoer distorts reality or reverses blame? That, of course, is a long-term project for many people. Some people never even get into the anger, never get into addressing the hurt with others, right? Sometimes, as a therapist, it's our job to kind of help people get in touch with that. Sometimes I find myself getting angry when I'm listening to a client in the woods talk about something, and they're not even angry about it, or I feel sad for them because of what's happened for them. Right? I'm taking on their feeling. So sometimes there's an encouragement to say you have to get into it, but some people, of course, stay stuck with it. Right? It's that old adage of drinking. Resentment is drinking a poison and expecting somebody else to suffer. So we'll talk a little bit tonight about that particular impasse. And Harriet takes a lot of attention, spends a lot of time on talking about that you don't have to let that person back into your life, but that you can get to a place of letting go, of working with the trauma of a more serious betrayal, and it's also okay to set a boundary with that person. Like I said, it's hard to forgive somebody when they're still in your life doing, in terms of a process, a very similar thing that you were first hurt by. What's the real reason you can't stop hating your ex or whomever? So we'll talk about that also tonight. I'll give you some ideas. So here are some ways that she identifies to ruin an apology. You include the word but. Pretty simple. I'm sorry for hurting you, but, and then you go on to justify it. I'm sorry you feel that way can feel very condescending, right? Like the problem is the way you feel. I'm sorry you were so sensitive instead of I'm sorry for yelling at you or bringing this up in a harsh way or betraying it, whatever it is that you did, right? The sexist comment that I made, the insensitive comment that I made, whatever it is. If you make the problem is the person is feeling something, then you're not really taking accountability. If it has an if in it, for example, I'm sorry if I was sensitive, right? That can feel very dismissive. And I think with all of these, it's an insane experience to be on the receiving end of these because you're often not tracking very well because you're heightened, you're upregulated, right? You have energy going on, and so some of the words sound like an apology, but you have an experience that is a re-injury, if you will, or a continuation of the injury. Taking responsibility for how the other person reacts, like I mentioned, can also be an inappropriate exercise of communicating healthy boundaries. You know, the forgive me and do it now kind of approach. I always say that the forgiveness comes on the terms of the person that's been hurt. Comes on their terms, not on the terms of the one who's done the hurting behavior. I think a lot of parents feel worried, afraid, guilty to be hurt, to have some anger, right, with their children. They feel like they have to move past it. What I say is this: you feel what you feel, and you get to do it on your terms. What you don't want to do is load that on top of your children. You don't want to give that to them, right? Give them that energy over and over again. But you get to take care of yourself. You get to not trust. You talk to your therapist. You talk to your sponsor, your mentor, your partner, somebody that you trust. You dump it on them. But you don't have to magically move past hurt, anger, to take care of somebody else. That's not okay. And people that are on the other side of the equation, if they are healthy, if they're really being accountable, and this happens all the time in our program, then they will be patient, even have empathy for your process. They won't ask you to forgive me and do it now. We do that in our coupleships. We do that in our parenting relationships. Our children say this to us. A lot of parents hear this and the process conversations with their children. The intrusive apology. The intrusive apology is showing up when somebody's not ready, right? I used to work with sex offenders, and some of them wanted to apologize to their victims or a specific victim. But they've had the message that person doesn't want them in their life. In the 9th step, in the 12th step, it says you make an amends, except for where to do so would cause more injury, another person harm. So when you come into it before somebody else is ready, it's intrusive. It's for you. It's not that generous expression of love that I talked about at the outset. Other ways to screw it up: over apologizing. It loses its sincerity. Something else is happening there. Crying somebody else's tears. If we show up, my wife taught me this very powerfully one time several years ago when I was apologizing for something that I felt really bad about, and I was kind of sulking. I was feeling a lot of shame, and I was looking down, and she literally raised me up, my chin up, and she said, "I need to be mad right now. Don't make this about you. Don't make it so that I have to take care of you. I'm just asking you to look me in the eyes and to be present with me and to hear what I'm feeling." And it was easy at that moment. Just it wasn't effortless or painless, but it was clear to me at that point how much I've been doing that in my life, and my apologies, because of the shame and guilt and not wanting to hurt people. So when we show up with our shame and it affects it, it pollutes the apology, the person then is being asked to take care of us. It's not about you. It's not about being forgiven, right? She doesn't talk about this in great detail, but so I'll add a little bit here. But you know, again, if forgiveness is what you're seeking instead of honoring, giving that generous gift with no strings attached, strings attached to it, then it's really for you. It's another selfish act in what was likely a selfish act, right? You know, in the letters of Juliet to the Knight in Rusty Armor, at the end, toward the end of the book, she says, in a very, very profound way, I'm sorry for how I've hurt you, and I don't know how you received this, and essentially I'm fine either way. I just want to give you this. Underdoing an apology too quickly can lead to that. You know, take some time, tell the person you're going to think about it, and then initiate and come back and think about it. This is one that I talk about, that I'll add, that she doesn't talk about, the I'm sorry, are you sorry kind of thing that we do sometimes in our coupleship. We're really wanting an apology, so we apologize, hoping then the other person is going to be effusive in their apology on the back end. And that's, again, it's not asking, that's not giving this gift, that's asking for something. When you are under fire, meaning the person is upset, attacking you, it is heroic to stay in there. Folks, I want to be clear when I talk about some of these things, some of the principles of enlightenment that I discuss. I'm never saying don't feel what you're feeling. I'm not saying don't feel defensive, don't feel angry, don't feel upset. I'm saying there's this ideal that we can strive for that we'll never probably perfectly consistently reach, right? None of us will. But we can see it, we can imagine it. And so a lot of times when I do well under fire, I'm not repressing a terrible amount of pain and shame. When I do well, I'm not feeling it. So if somebody's yelling at me, calling me names, being critical, attacking me, and I do well with that, it's because I'm grounded. I'm better at it at work than I am at home. My daughter, who works for me, was happy to point out one time. So it's about developing capacity. It's not about being inauthentic. Don't offer a faux apology, right? A fake apology just to check it off the list. That's not going to work. It takes a lot of capacity, like I said, and it's okay to take space and time. Thich Nhat Hanh, the principle that he talks about is you try to practice a dear one attitude, toward others. And when you can, you do. And when you can't, you say, in essence, dear one, I can't do this right now. It's Christmas Eve. That's an example that Harriet used in her book. It's Christmas Eve, or I'm stressed. I'm depleted right now. I need to go take care of myself. And then you go and take care of yourself, and then you come back when you can. So it's the process of self-care, not trying to be something you can't be at that moment, and that's okay. Own your limitations. Respond to them, feed them. Fill yourself up until you can be there for them. It's okay to ask for space and time. How willing, how able are you to sit on the hot seat, right? And you can't do that when you're depleted. You can't do that if you're raw, if you're angry. So it's okay. Listening and understanding is not agreeing. So you can listen to them, be curious. Harriet talks a lot in the book about asking questions. This part, tell me more. Gives a great example of a very heroic apology between a mother and a daughter, where the mother's doing the apologizing and is willing to hear the daughter, willing to ask questions, to think about it, and to come back to it more than once, right? Check in on it again. Take the space and time when it's appropriate to clarify. I talk about this in my book when I say in the communication chapter that clarifying can come after whatever feeling is there has been given its due space, right? And I say, I don't know if that's a minute or 5 minutes or 5 hours or 5 days or 5 years, but I know it's a space. And it's practice. It's an art to kind of practice that and to know it. And maybe you check in. And the example in the book, she says, after listening to her daughter quite well about some very painful things, she wasn't perfect in the beginning, but she came back and she listened. Then she clarified, where we're different is I'm not responsible for what he did, for how he responded. That's not mine. Dialing down defensiveness. How can we dial down our defensiveness? First of all, recognize it, she says. Recognize your defenses. Learn to breathe. Mindfulness, right? Learn to be centered in yourself. Takes time and space with your breath. Try and listen to understand. Maintain the spirit of curiosity. Not to understand, to figure everything out so that it makes perfect sense to you, so your feelings are satisfied, but to understand, to be compassionate, to give a place for the other person to unpack their grief and their hurt. Find something you can agree with. I mean, I know you've seen this. It's magical when somebody, when you're on the other side of it, and somebody says, "Yeah, I could have done that better." You're right. Just agreeing with part of it. I could have said that another time. I could have waited till we were alone, or not on a conference call, or whatever it is. That can be powerful. Can be powerful to hear that expression of empathy, even if it's just for part. Apologize for your part. Be clear about what you did. Let them know that you've heard them and will continue to think about it. It's incredibly powerful. It gives the person a sense of being honored. Thank them for sharing their hurt. It takes great courage, right? And it's hard, folks. I know I've had it from my young children. I had my 15-year-old in family therapy this summer several times, and I've had it from my older children who've done a lot of their own work. It's hard because you don't want to fail. You don't want to be a bad dad, bad mom. It's painful to look at that. It's the thing that most of us hold most sacred in our lives, that role of being a parent. And so when we've hurt people because of our wounds, because of our limitations, it's hard to hear that. So thank them for sharing it. Thank them for the honor that they'd be willing to tell you. That's magic. Bring it up again. Initiate that. Be the initiator of that. And you can set limits with insults, with language. Like I said earlier, my thought about it is the more grounded I am, the more full I am spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, the less I need the apology to fit in a small bandwidth. But I have a bandwidth, and I'm allowed to ask for what I need in it. Don't listen when you can't do it well. Similar thing that I've talked about, and define the differences that you see at some point after you've honored this process. You do not need to forgive the person who has hurt you in order to free yourself from obsessive anger and bitterness. Indeed, sometimes you have to be brave enough to resist pressure from the forgiveness cops. It might be a semantics argument here, right? Because forgiveness, the definition of forgiveness might be different for different people. But what she's basically saying is you don't have to let them back in your life, right? You don't have to do that to move on. You can let go without what she calls forgiving people. What's yours and what's theirs. A sincere apology means that we are fully accountable for the part that we are responsible for, and only for that. Right? It's also healthy psychological boundaries. Like the example from the Anatomy of Peace that I quote in my book, where the mother, after the first day of the wilderness group, back at the hotel, says to her husband, "I feel so horribly for the things that I've done." And her Lou, her husband, says, "You didn't put any of those drugs into Chris's mouth." And then she pauses and looks at Lou and she said, "You don't understand. I don't feel sorry for what Chris did. I feel sorry for what I did." And it's a very different and important distinction. And like I said, it comes on the terms of the offended. Forgiveness. The one that's been hurt gets to decide. I tweeted this the other day too. It reminds me of this principle that trauma is anything less than ideal. When we think about trauma, defining it in that way, anything less than ideal, we free ourselves up, we honor the other person, we get out of the power struggle. Similarly here, when I let you have your process, that's part of the gift of the loving gift of an apology. What is his or her defensiveness has to do to you? Like I said, you can look at that, ask questions about that. Is there anything that I'm doing that leads you to feel less safe? The pursuer distancer, she goes in depth about this idea that the attack and the defender, pursuer, distancer, that can be a dynamic that's hard to get out of. The defender blames the pursuer for being attacking, and the attacking person blames the defender for not being sensitive and owning enough of their stuff. So she talks about ways to get out of that, to take one step, one empathic step. Apologize for one small thing. Acknowledge one small piece. I put on here, if it's not hysterical, it's historical, meaning that this is a slogan that they talk about in Al-Anon, that if my energy, you left the ice cream out and it melted, for example, something silly like that. But I blow that out of proportion. Something else is going on underneath. Right? There's other hurt that now this is becoming the vehicle through which I express that hurt. All right? So taking a look at that. I put this under the heading of understanding your child. She didn't list it this way, but I think it's so powerful because I think I've thought about this as a therapist and as a father. I think we spend so much time on if we trust the child. We spend so much energy and time trying to explain things to the child in our program over the years. And sometimes I don't think I included, spend enough time saying, I wonder if they trust me. I wonder if I'm safe. Right? So she says, if only our passion to understand the other person were as great as our passion to be understood. Were this so, all of our apologies would be truly meaningful and healing. My invariant prescription that I talk about is that idea of just finding things to apologize for in this healthy way. It is one of the most valuable ways to model for your child, to encourage vulnerability, to make yourself safe. See, if you're vulnerable, it's disarming because then you're not a threat. But if you're perfect and right, and you don't have the problem, that can be very intimidating and very threatening. Shame, of course, is a big barrier that she talks about in the book. The worse the offense, then the greater the shame, the more difficult it is for the wrongdoer to empathize with the harmed party and feel remorse. When our identity and sense of worth are at risk of being diminished or annihilated, we will not be able to offer a true apology and face all that the challenge of earning back trust entails. We are more likely to wrap ourselves in a blanket of rationalization, minimization, and denial in order to survive. Defensiveness is no longer merely a roadblock that we can observe and get past after we calm down and limber up the thinking part of our brain. When we have lost sight of our value and worth, defensiveness is where we live. When we don't know that we're okay, this is how we will show up, defending, needing to be right, rationalizing, justifying. I see it all the time. I've done it countless amounts of times in all of my relationships. Most people who commit serious harm never get to the point where they can admit to their harmful actions, much less apologize and aim to repair them. Their shame leads to denial and self-deception that overrides their ability to orient toward reality. No person can be more honest with us than they can be with their own self. It is a little counterintuitive because we use the phrase, have you no shame? Where is your shame? When really, what's really going on in these cases that she's describing where people have done great harm and have no ability to apologize is more shame. It happens with teenagers and young adults too. They look shameless when really they're filled with shame. They look like they're doing everything that looks like they don't care or have empathy or feel, but really that is an overcompensation and reaction against too much shame. Sometimes she talks about the non-apologizer. Excuse me, she talks about the non-apologizer in the book. She says sometimes it's gender related. It could be the family of origin rules. Right? We don't apologize in this family. Parents don't apologize. Right? Don't do anything that you know, being a lady is something, is never having to say you're sorry. That can be our culture. I just want to understand mistakes. There's this idea that if I can just understand why he abused me, if I can just understand why they did this, then I can get past it, right? And that can be a trap, a cycle that we never get out of. She talks about how we use these labels. My mother's a narcissist. My ex-husband is a sociopath. My ex-wife is a borderline. And we use these labels in order to kind of explain them in such a way to make all of our hurt make sense, right? And learning to see the other, learning to see them doesn't rob us, doesn't have to rob us of our boundaries, right? If your empathy or understanding of your child, and I see this a lot with parents, if it robs you of your right, internal right to set boundaries, it's too far. I think a lot of people stay in abusive relationships seeking to understand, trying to solve the puzzle, to change the other person, but in some ways because they see the other person's wounds. Parents see this. Well, we were divorced, or he was adopted, or I wasn't home, whatever it is. And so somehow that suggests to the parent that they are not allowed to set a boundary, have a consequence. And you are. You can do that. I love this quote. Perfectionism, when she's talking about losing your sense of self-worth, and she's describing it in various ways, she said, the perfectionist is walking a tightrope above a canyon of low self-esteem. We see people that present themselves to be perfect, that need to be perfect, that try to be perfect. We do that sometimes. That's not a sign of feeling confident. It's a sign that we're dramatically insecure, and that tenuous place of being good enough rests on the idea that we have to get it right to be perfect as a parent. She talks about the idea of learning to just give a simple thank you for an apology. Don't dismiss it. She gives an example of somebody who was complaining about a hurt in a relationship. And then when the apology came, she said, no big deal. Doesn't matter. I think I've told the story. Well, I know I've told the story many times of one of my children when I apologized for snapping at them, and they said, it's okay. And I said, no, it's not okay. What I did is not okay. Right? She gives another example where, really, again, with no intent, she offered, sitting in a crowded airport, offered some candy to a little child that was sitting next to her. The mother was sitting right by, and offered some of her trail mix to the child. And after a moment, it dawned on her, like, I didn't ask the mother, and that's not okay. And so she turned to the mother and she said, I'm sorry for offering your child candy without asking you. And the mother said, thank you. And all of a sudden, then it hit her. Like, yeah, that was a big deal. That's not okay. So just learn to say thank you. There's a difference between forgiving and letting go. In her book, she talks about forgiving is you don't have to let the person back in. Don't have to stay in a relationship with them. It doesn't mean that you're carrying around this like toxic resentment. You can learn to let that go. She talks about a specific client doing some EMDR, some real deep trauma work to deal with a betrayal in her marriage. My thought about it is I share often that becoming obsessed with the injustice of the whole thing is my sign to me that I'm stuck. And it is my job to let it go. And I often won't get cooperation. It's nice if I do from the other person, but I often won't get it from the other person. So what are our take-homes? Show your children how it's done. Best way to teach accountability is to be accountable, to embody it. Allowing for different apology languages. Right? Sometimes an apology comes in the form of a change in behavior. She gives an example of a client that it's not in either of their culture to apologize. But when the husband made significant, sincere attempts to be there for the wife, the relationship dramatically improved. Living in a 10-step way. 10th step is when in AA and Al-Anon is continue to take a personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Right? That's what addicts in recovery practice, aspire to practice. What if we all did that? Wouldn't that be fantastic? But again, so many of us are afraid of letting go of that control. Right? If I apologize, I'm losing some position, some strength. My child is going to use it against me. But when we embrace this paradigm, It actually makes you more powerful. It makes you more effective. You have to know that you're okay. And sometimes the cultural differences, the way that we were taught in our family of origin, sometimes we have to get past those, push those aside, challenge those. It really is a heroic thing to apologize. It is a surrender. It's something where we demonstrate, in some ways, our greatest capacity. Be careful of the forgiveness police, the ones who tell you you need to forgive in a certain way at a certain time and a certain person and accept certain things. That's a big message in her book. If it's stuck, if it's eating away at you, there's work to be done. If you don't let the person back in your life, that can be okay. That can even be stronger and more brave. Like I said, it's hard to forgive sometimes when it's still happening. I know an example of a client years ago who'd been abused by somebody in the family, and the family was still letting this person around, hang out with the family. And she was beating herself up because she couldn't get past this thing that had happened 20 years ago. And I said, it's still happening. That's why it's so hard to beat yourself up for it when your family is still allowing this person in the family, having them over, acting like nothing happened. It's still happening. Be generous, right? It's a generous expression. And like I said, this is my kind of concluding message. Apologizing is a gift of love, and it cannot be used against us if we do it for the right reason. All right, I'm happy to take any questions. When I apologize, first one, when I apologize to my 25-year-old son for something like, I'm sorry, I must have misunderstood what you said, he has a pattern of responding angrily. Okay, but you have to stop doing that. I have my responses, but I'm eager to hear what yours would be. That's okay. I mean, sometimes the apology stokes the flame of anger, right? Because you're giving them permission. So just stick with it. I'm working on it, and I might screw up again, but I'm gonna keep working on it. Be human about it. All right. Just own it. I mean, he's saying, yeah, well then don't do it again. And your response is, I'm gonna try. Plain and simple, I'm gonna try. That's my thought. That's my response to it. How do you set limits with insults? I find this to be really hard. Tend to need time and space for this. How much time and space should you allow? That's a very personal decision. I can tolerate more than I could 10 or 15 years ago. Doesn't hurt me. It's not about me. That's been some of my work, some of the fruits of my own work. You just take a time out. You take a time out. I can't do this right now. Some cases you have to hang up the phone, walk out of the room. In some more extreme cases, they don't get to be in your life anymore. This is a consistent pattern that they're not willing to look at and address. So it can go from anything from just taking a time out, which is probably the most mild end, just breathing, walking away, to the most significant end, which is I can't be in this relationship if this is what it's going to consist of. And then, of course, there are many steps in between. And it is hard. Boundaries are hard. We would rather try to beg, to plead, to coerce, to manipulate, to try to get somebody to change. Because if they change, then we don't have to set a boundary. And boundaries are scary, hard, uncomfortable. We weren't, for most of us, they weren't encouraged, right? They weren't nurtured in our childhood. So it's the work that I work on with clients more than anything. Just taking care of yourself and having that be okay. Because somehow we were taught that we were wrong, that we had crazy feelings, that we were being selfish, on and on and on. Could you please expand on the point about listening only to understand and then understanding not to satisfy myself? I don't get the rest of that point. Well, there's a kind of a probing, like understanding for the point of if I can just understand why he abused me, then it will be okay. Right? That doesn't necessarily make sense, and you'll probably never find that. But if I understand where you're coming from, because I want to understand you, that's okay. But if it's trying to put together a puzzle so that it all makes sense, so that somehow magically then I won't feel hurt or abused anymore, that won't work. But if I understand where you're coming from, then that's a compassionate offering. Can you explain the role of gender of the non-apologizer? She talks about women tend to over apologize, and that men would fall more on the non-apologizer side of things, and she gives examples of it. And she's clear to say it doesn't have to fall along those lines. But there's something in our culture that encourages or suggests that women are to apologize, and men are weak if they apologize. And so she says that genders, male and female genders, tend to embody those cultural ideas that women need to apologize and men can't show weakness. I've been so aware of my own shame and guilt entering apologies, especially with my children, to not make them have to care for me. There have been times when I couldn't hold the tears back, though. It's true. You know, that brings me to that same kind of point. The coolest thing that I can leave you with is you're going to make mistakes. And if your children need you to be perfect for everything to go okay, they're doomed. And so showing up more human, owning your own idiocy, as I talk about in my book, that's really, and that's not a weakness where we then get walked all over. It comes from a place of strength, and we also, in our own idiocies, we get to set boundaries and take care of ourselves, right? If you have to be right to do that, you're in trouble. And if being an idiot means that you don't have any rights, you're in trouble. But if you can just show up as a human, fallible parent whose project it is to be the best you can be, it's a fantastic model for your child. What do you recommend when the other who has betrayed says, I don't apologize, so just move on and forget about it? You're going to have to go somewhere else. You're going to have to go somewhere else. They're not going to participate in it. A lot of us will stay stuck in that, trying to get them to change and believing, experiencing that they need to change in order for us to move on. So you're going to have to go to a therapist. In one case, she said about her client in the book, like, your ex-husband's never going to apologize. So you're going to have to go to therapy. And among other things, she took a workshop, a practice of going to EMDR, which is helping to overcome trauma. And it made a lot of progress in that area. So go to Al-Anon, go to Codependence Anonymous. Those are free sources, but going to therapy is kind of my method. What do you say to the person who apologizes and they are insincere and you know they don't mean it? They just want to move past the incident and get over it and win. How do you deal with this? It's a good question. I mean, essentially, you've got to be willing to have a dialogue. And you've got to, it's okay to own your own power if you want to say, I'm not ready yet. And you might want to move on and I'm not ready yet. And maybe we can revisit this or talk about this in therapy. I'd like to talk about it still. I don't want to beat you over the head with it indefinitely. And I might be inclined to do that, but I don't want to do that. But I'm not ready to move past it. And I need to forgive and move past it on my own time. You assert yourself. You own it. And that's okay. And sometimes that can be verbal, and sometimes you just show up that way. Right? Sometimes it's in your silence. But that's a tough one. How is forgiveness defined? Is it both in feeling and action? Where does an authentic feeling of forgiveness come from? Does it originate with some extent with shame or guilt? That's a great question. I think Harriet, you can read the book yourself. I think she talks about it in terms of the idea is that the forgiveness that it just melts away. That's why she says you don't have to forgive, that somehow it disappears, melts away. And she talks about it in terms of letting people back in your life. She talks about people who, one particular friend who was significantly betrayed by another friend, and that friend reached out and asked to reconnect, and she said, I've moved past it. I've forgiven you, but I'm not letting you back in my life. Like I don't want to pursue a relationship with you. Like I've let go. So I think Harriet talks about it in those terms. Like you can still have your boundaries. You can still do what you do. Um, you know, for me, forgiveness comes from the place of having experienced others forgiving me, having experienced what I call grace. And I talk about this idea that where there is grace, shame disappears. Shame melts in the face of grace. So when I've had to come to terms with my own jerkness, and I've had people forgive me, my own idiocies, my own stupidity, when I've had to come to terms with that in my process, then really, and how healing that has been for me, then it's become really easy for me to do that for other people. Sometimes I can do it immediately, even as somebody's hurting me, because I realize that they're just wounded. I don't, like she talks about in the book, I don't necessarily let them in my life if the hurt or the betrayal is significant enough. But I realize that that comes from a wounded place, and it's not about me. Sometimes we struggle with it because of ego, like I don't want to be walked on, ego kind of way, right? Or it would be weak of me to forgive. But I can think of, and I've had somebody tell me, given specific examples in my life where somebody has tried to hurt me, and I've forgiven them the moment that they were trying to hurt me. Somebody said to me, "Well, you're a bigger person than I am," and I said, "I'm not bigger. I just had to come to a point in my life where I either had to hate myself and everybody else, or I had to accept and love myself and forgive other people. And that does not compromise my boundaries or who's in my life. In fact, what coincided with my own development in this area was I actually became better at boundaries, better at saying no, better at extricating anybody from my life who would treat me in a way that I found unacceptable, without anger, without resentment, with clarity and compassion for them and for myself. So that's where it comes from for me. I worked on healing my own broken heart, but also now have no relationship with the person, but still wish him well. That sounds great. Any other questions? No other questions? All right. We ask all parents to go to 6 12-step support groups while your child is here, so please go. They're free. If nothing else, you'll get a sense of what it feels like to walk into a group like your child has had to do. You'll have sympathy for them. Follow us on social media if you're on social media. The podcasts, you can listen to the podcast. The podcasts are free to anybody. You can share those with your friends. On the iPhone, it's on the podcast app. Just search Evoke Therapy Program. If you have an Android device, download the SoundCloud app and then search Evoke Therapy Programs. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram. You get announcements, inspirational stories, articles, quotes. Follow us on Facebook at Evoke Therapy Programs, same kind of thing. If you go to the Second Nature Alumni Foundation on Facebook, you can find out about an organization of alumni parents that is there to help people who can't afford therapy. You can go to the Evoke Therapy blog. My book is available on Amazon, even though it says there on the right that it's out of stock. If you look at the buying options there are new copies that are available. You can also buy an audio version of it or an electronic version of it. If you go to the Parent Alumni Foundation book page through the Amazon Smiles program, buy a book there that we recommend on various topics. A percentage of the proceeds goes to help the Alumni Foundation. All right, upcoming workshops. Anybody can go to the workshop. You don't have to just be at Entrada. You can go be at Cascades and go to the Entrada one, or vice versa. The next one is September 23rd and 24th. We ask, if at all you can, we ask all parents to come to one of these while their child is with us, if you possibly can. I'm not going to deny you the program, but we strongly encourage it. People love it. It's a field staff, multifamily experience. Is fantastic. The intensives that I run, the September one is closed. Somebody's taken that on to be a personal intensive. The next the next one that's open is in October 18th through 21st, and November 13th through 16th. These are to do deep personal work. If you want to go beyond the larger groups and do some deep personal work. These are the ones that I currently run. You can attend those. You can also do a private family intensive, psychodrama, mindfulness, and a cabin that we have up in Park City, or out at the Oasis if you so desire, and the temperature and the weather is acceptable. All right, upcoming parent support groups. We have some space still left in the Sunday, September 24th, Los Angeles area parent support group. So we have a handful of spaces still left, and there is limited space. I've moved those to be on Sunday afternoon to help our LA area folks with traffic. It starts off with a potluck, so when you commit, you show up, and then we have a 2-hour parent meeting. It's in Studio City, California, and love to see you there. So RSVP as soon as possible, specifically to that one. The others are more flexible, but that one is limited space only. In the Bay Area, I'll be doing it the next night on the September 25th, 7 to 9 p.m. at the Courtyard Marriott Larkspur Landing, Corte Madera. So it's the Courtyard Marriott. It says Larkspur Landing / Corte Madera on the website. Washington, D.C., tentatively, we're doing a parent group on October 12th. We'll give you more details. That's the week of the Wilderness Play. We don't know if the Wilderness Play is gonna travel more. You know, we're hoping to raise money because it's a nonprofit. We don't know if it will or not. So this may be the last chance to see it. Even if you live out of the area, you want to make the trip there. You can also come to the parent support group. In New York City, the next, the tentative schedule we have is for Sunday, October 29th, and Chicago, the tentative date is the week of November 13th. All of those will be firming up as we meet together as a team. You can go, a Pursuits program is for young adults or for families. Think of it as therapy light or therapy with fun, high adventure. Somebody asked one other question: do I take private clients via the phone? I don't. I don't have any. You know, these clients that I talk about, I have a few of them, and I've had them for a long time, and I don't take any new ones on. I actually have a couple more than I probably than my schedule can demand. So I'm sorry, I don't. Thank you for asking though. And then someone wrote, "Thanks to Brad, you're the bomb." Appreciate that. You're the bomb.com. I appreciate it. I need all that I can get. All right, we'll let you know when the next webinar is coming. Thank you. Hope this is a helpful point of contact for you all. And again, go read Harriet Lerner's book, The Dance of Anger. If the topic tonight interests you, whether you're on either side of the equation, also pick up her newest book, Why Won't You Apologize? Be fantastic. Have a great evening, folks, and I will talk to you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.